One, two, three, four, five. Hi, welcome to La Raza Unida Party's Platica for November 2021. This week, we are joined by two experts in the field of history to discuss the history of the Mexican Revolution and its impact and significance to our struggle here in the United States and internationally today in 2021. It's been about 100 years since the end of the Mexican Revolution. The period lasted from, for most arguments, from 1910 to 1920. Understanding the Mexican Revolution gives us a lot of different, diverse viewpoints to consider and lessons to learn. In fact, as La Raza Unida members and thinking about La Raza Unida's message to broader public audiences, we have to consider the revolutionary lessons of the Mexican Revolution and how, in fact, Dia de la Revolución gives us an opportunity, which was November 20th in Mexico and not often celebrated in the United States, think about the lessons of the revolution for ourselves in our historical moment, and also thinking about the ways that those have interacted and built upon social change in the 20th century till now. I want to introduce our two guests. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Gerald Horn. Dr. Horn is a professor at the University of Houston. He holds the John and J. Rebecca Morse Chair of History and African American Studies there. He was raised in St. Louis, Missouri, attended undergraduate at Princeton University, received his PhD from Columbia University, and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. He has written extensively, published books ranging from topics on W.E.B. Du Bois to labor conflict in Hawaii and Los Angeles, as well as other places in the United States. And his most recent book, The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing, deals with class struggle in boxing as a sport and entertainment category. Dr. Macías is, I'm sorry, let me pull up your bio here. Dr. Macías, forgive me. Dr. Macías was born in Durango, Mexico, but raised in Los Angeles and Hermosillo, Sonora. He did his undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of Arizona with a master's in public administration and Latin American studies. He obtained his doctorate in 2018. He currently teaches Latin American history at Fort Hays State University in Kansas. His research interests include the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa and popular representations, and more recently, how memories are shaped by smell, taste, and other senses. Dr. Macías and Dr. Horn, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amalo and Dr. Horn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to talk today, as I talked about in our introduction to the topic, thinking about the Mexican Revolution in its context, in connection to our lives today, and wondering if I could start you both out thinking about what is a lesson, what is something that we can think about from the Mexican Revolution and its impact on a wide variety of people, not just people in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, but also beyond as well, and how we can apply those lessons to thinking about our position as maybe inheritors of a certain understanding of social change that the Mexican Revolution experimented with in parts.
Well, defer to Dr. Macías.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask who you wanted first to start. So being one of the first revolutions of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution does provide significant social, economic change to the average Mexican citizen. But it goes beyond that, right? Because leading up or during a porfiriato, the time, the era prior to the revolution that starts in 1910, you have all this immigration of U.S. citizens that actually start even beforehand, by arguably shortly thereafter the end of the Mexican-American War, but especially after the Civil War, where you have a lot of ex-Confederate soldiers trying to set up shop in northern Mexico. but also even, former slaves or slaves trying to running away from Texas, they see, and the South, they see Mexico as that land of opportunity. So both countries have always been interconnected, but the Mexican Revolution brought many opportunities, but it displaced also a lot of people, right? So, and one thing that Dr. Horne touched upon in the book is the violence upon, Americans within Mexico during the revolution, but also, you have massive migration of people of Mexican descent. So arguably, though many Mexican Americans can trace their lineage back to, my family members escaped from the time of the Mexican Revolution, and because when I follow Pancho Villa, is they typically have a Pancho Villa story where it's like, if it's because Pancho Villa came into my village, and that's, my great grandmother immigrated, and that's why we're here. So I think that's how, at least initially, the Mexican Revolution has a significant impact on the border region.
I would only add to that the regional, hemispheric, and global consequences. For example, this is a lesson that perhaps we can even extend to today. That is to say that German-U.S. relations were quite complicated during that entire pivotal decade. You may recall that World War I, what we refer to the Great War, erupts in 1914, and eventually the United States joins in that war against the German side. And historically, in the borderlands, at least since the failed revolutions of 1848, you had a substantial population of German descent. I would say particularly in Texas, but even before the Civil War, you had a migration of what used to be called Prussian houses, that is to say merchants, into various points of Mexico, particularly Tampico, for example. And so with the Mexican Revolution and the contradictions and the conflicts between Washington and Berlin, it was possible for Berlin to seek to work with Mexico against the interests of Washington. And I think going forward in the 21st century and beyond, that's something to keep an eye on, particularly as relations between Washington and China become more complicated. I would also say that the violence that afflicts particularly people of Mexican origin on this side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border, is nothing less than breathtaking. The evidence is formidable. In fact, there's this historian at the University of Texas at Austin who's written a book about it. Monica, I'm sure you know her last name.
Not off the top of my head, but yes, is it about the lynching of Mexicans in Texas?
Yeah, exactly. She devotes quite a bit of time into that pivotal decade. You also see, as I say in my book, during this decade, an ongoing trend that Professor Macías has already pointed out. The ongoing trend being Black people from the United States crossing the border into Mexico in search of promise. This, as you know, was a factor leading to the secession of Texas from Mexico in the counter-revolution of 1836, which is the title of a book that I'll publish probably next year. And this seeing Mexico as a beacon, enormously complicated relations between Washington and Mexico City throughout the 19th century, particularly post-1836, and continues, of course, into the revolutionary decade. So I'll stop there and wait for another intercession.
One thing that I left out at the beginning of the introductions is that a lot of today's conversation is driven by Dr. Horn's book, Black and Brown. Black and Brown African Americans in the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. In that book, which was published in 2005, there are a lot of points that have been brought up by both Dr. Macías and Dr. Horne. Thinking about that book, one of the things that you start with is you talk about Jack Johnson and Jack Johnson's movement internationally as a Black American moving around the world, including to Mexico during the Revolution and during the period in which Venustiano Carranza was in power. One of the things that we really think about is the ways in which the Mexican Revolution reflected hopes for Black people, but also Mexicanos, and not just Mexicanos in Mexico, but we know, as your book attests to, Mexicanos living in southwestern cities as well, looked to the Mexican Revolution as a promise for social change, as did African Americans and other Afro-diasporic people. I wonder if thinking about the changes between that period of the revolution and what occurred by the end of the revolution in the 1920s, if we can think about how revolutionary processes there played out in ways that inspired later or further changes to Black American, Mexican American, and obviously even Yaqui and other people, indigenous people in the borderlands, as well as indigenous communities in Mexico as well, and Mexican African or Afro-Mexican descendant communities. There's a lot to unpack, but hopefully there's some questions in there.
Well, obviously one of the major tragedies when we talk about the borderlands is what afflicted the indigenous population in particular. Not only the Yaquis, not only the Karankawa, the Tonkawa, the Comanche, the Mescalero, Apache, the Kiowa, the Caddo. And what's striking to me in retrospect is the explicit orders for genocide issued by U.S. officialdom. And what's even more troubling to me, I must confess, is the contradiction that emerges by the end of the 19th century, which is the precursor to the Revolutionary Decade, whereby you see the end of the U.S. Civil War, and which only, well, I would argue that ends the way it does, not least because of that war-fighting measure known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which then leads to an enlistment of thousands, tens of thousands of Black soldiers into the Lincoln government army, which turns the tide against the Confederacy, which had been doing quite well up to that point. And what's striking there, just as a side note, is that we all know about the French occupation of Mexico in the 1860s. Less well known is the fact that France was collaborating with Egypt to bring Africans, sometimes perhaps even enslaved Africans from Egypt and Sudan, to Mexico to prop up Maximilian, for example. And at the same time, you had these Black American soldiers post Appomattox, post the Confederate surrender, 1865, who were facing them across the border. And one of the points I think that we'll take away eventually is that the U.S. Civil War did not necessarily end in April 1865 with Appomattox. Much has been made about Juneteenth, the new holiday about the end of slavery in Texas and presumably in the United States, June 19th, 1865. But the other Juneteenth that really matters is June 19th, 1867, when Maximilian is executed. And with the execution of Maximilian, you see the deflation of the rebel threat, the Confederate threat, because they had moved by the thousands into Mexico, as has already been suggested, and were continuing the U.S. Civil War. So it really doesn't end until Maximilian is executed in June 19th, 1867. And I could go on in this vein, and excuse me for concentrating so much on this, but I've been writing about this for the last few months, so it's all occupying a lot of my mental space.
That's an important precursor moment to what eventually will be a segregated U.S. armed forces, right? That's the formation of a segregated U.S. armed forces, which later will kind of invade northern Mexico and police the northern border, right? Marco?
Yes, I'm also very intrigued about the Confederate presence along the border and their dealing with Maximiliano, because they're land speculators, they're slaveholders. They just want to preserve the institution of slavery in another place. So, I mean, and that's what you end up seeing, right? Not only in Mexico, but also Brazil, where a lot of former Confederates end up in Brazil to try and create community. But within, of course, creating that community is the perpetuation of the institution of slavery. So yeah, it just, Mexico has always been there with the United States. And sometimes, when at the end of the Mexican-American War, there was the discussion, right, of, why doesn't the U.S. just take the entirety of Mexico? But the issue was, well, the other southern part of Mexico is full of Mexicans, so you don't want to have to deal with race relations, because this is a very racist nation, and we just don't want to deal with the question of it. And so, right, it's one of these lingering issues that the book, I think the book captures in the essence, right, of the presence of African American troops along the border, and how they have to do they're there to do the bidding of the U.S. government, which is not very kind in exterminating indigenous people. And one thing I really found interesting in reading your book, Dr. Horn, is the fact that the fear that existed within U.S. society of a racial uprising, and it just, it's always there, right? But I had never really considered it that way, where there is truly a fear, and how do we control the border and prevent a race war? So it's very systematic of recognition that we are doing very racist things. Hopefully those things won't come back to catch us in the 19 teens, as we are trying to go to the First World War, and we're trying to rally supports, and they're trying to control various things at the same time.
Well, sure. And what's interesting about that is that it reaches a kind of apex during the Revolutionary decade with the so-called Plan de San Diego, which many people have written about, including myself, which supposedly envisioned Mexico reclaiming the territory that it had lost to the United States War of Aggression in the 1840s, and then establishing in its stead independent Black and Native American republics on that soil. And of course, in terms of the external support, purportedly there was external support, perhaps from Japan, perhaps from Germany as well. And in many ways, the Mexican Revolution helped to expose the Achilles heel of U.S. imperialism. The Achilles heel, of course, being the unremitting racism and white supremacy, which then causes its victims to look overseas for support, which then leads to episodes like the Plan de San Diego. And secondly, the fact that Mexico and the United States are not necessarily always on the same page when it comes to slavery, for example, which that, of course, led to the war of aggression of the 1840s. And arguably, even today, there are many pivotal questions on which Mexico and the United States are not on the same page. And in doing my research on this 19th century book on the borderlands, what's striking to me is how many U.S. consulates there are, and I guess still are, in Mexico, in Matamoros, and Tampico, and Acapulco, Guaymas, Mazatlan, of course, Mexico City, Veracruz, Monterrey, across from what we now call El Paso, Piedras Negras. And there's this incessant, constant surveillance of what's going on in Mexico. In part, a recognition of how Mexico, in many ways, is the Achilles heel of U.S. expansionism, which, of course, then leads to these wars. But what's interesting as well is that even after they seize a good deal of Mexican territory, that does not satisfy their ravenous appetite, because then the idea was to perhaps seize Nicaragua through the William Walker expedition of the 1850s. And then, of course, you had this idea personified by Sam Houston, the man who's gave his name to the city I'm now sitting in, where the idea was not for the slave owners and the North to go to war, but instead to unite, to seize more of Mexico, to seize more of the hemisphere, to seize Cuba, for example, which had been a long-term ambition of Washington to take over Cuba. And that plan was formalized through an organization which we need to know more about, called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which Sam Houston supposedly had a relationship to. But in any case, it bespeaks this long-term trend of Washington, United States, trying to gobble up more of Mexico.
I think what's really interesting too is the reality that not only is the security concern international and based on expansion, long-time plans of expansion into Mexico by the United States and by the United States federal government, but also it deals with internal insecurity within the ostensible post-1846 borders, right? I think you write here that I really like this quote. I wrote it down, that what happened in the area that had been seized from Mexico in 1846 to 1854 was the creation of many different racial microclimates. And you put racial in quotation marks, right? Because objectively, race isn't really the issue, but there are different social constructions of race that dot this area that was taken from Mexico. And obviously the same is true on the other side of the border as well, where U.S. company towns, U.S. imperialist kind of finance monopoly is extending places like Tampico as well, where you talk about there being African-American workers and military, as well as the military zone where there are African-American and Native. You often talk about Apache scouts as well. But this creates this whole kind of North American area of insecurity for the United States that really people in the United States take seriously as an existential threat to their existence, which is so interesting to think about. And the way that we understand and conceive of the Mexican Revolution is often limited, if at all, right? We don't even celebrate Dia de la Revolución in most Mexican American communities that I know of here in the United States, or most Chicanx communities. That's not a piece of our calendar, unlike September 16th, which is. So it's interesting to kind of recenter and rethink about the importance of the Mexican Revolution in highlighting all these points where it's a legitimate anti-imperialist kind of revolution, and it comes after a couple of other ones, right? The beginning of combat against the U.S. occupation in the Philippines happens, I think, 1901, 1902, and 1903. That's kind of that period. Arguably, the seizure in 1905 of the Russian Empire's kind of seed, and kind of the beginning of a constituent government in 1904 in that 1904 or 1905 Russian Revolution. But the Mexican Revolution is a major watershed period for world history in a lot of ways, and it is often provincialized. But we can see that there are a lot of pieces that touch other places, kind of hemispherically and globally. One of the things that I found was interesting, Marco, I don't know if you saw this as well in Dr. Horn's book, since you work a lot on cultural perceptions of Pancho Villa, I was surprised to learn that African American publications had rewritten Pancho Villa to be African descent, Afro-Mexican in several cases. That was very interesting to see. Had you heard of those cases before, or were there other focuses on Villa that you're familiar with in a similar or anti-imperialist, anti-communist kind of mode?
I agree. Villa is a fascinating subject. No, well, yes. So first of all, yes, I had heard about some of the Villa stories of him not even being Mexican, but rather a deserter from the U.S. Army that went into Mexico and started a revolution. But the fascinating thing about these stories is they're occurring in the 19-teens, right? So there are newspaper reports coming out from throughout the United States claiming these stories, and it's part of the fascination with Villa, right? And I did put here, and I put a bookmark because I need to look more into this on page 147 about him being popularized by Bert Williams, incorporating impressions of him in his act. I just found that super fascinating, and I actually want to know more about that because I'm writing on popular perceptions of Villa in pop culture and collective memory. So Villa is one of these fascinating figures that everybody's interested in, right? Even during the putative expedition, where you have Buffalo Soldiers looking for him, arguably it was the Buffalo Soldiers that came the closest to capturing Villa. So after Villa attacks Columbus, New Mexico in March of 1916, he heads for the mountains in Mexico. We have the putative expedition, and then Villa is hiding in the mountains, recovering from a leg wound, and people that were with him remember in their memoirs that they could hear black soldiers singing on the road to Tipperary as they were walking through a canyon. So of course they didn't know what the lyrics were, but on the other hand, but they remember the tune when they heard it afterwards. So that's how close Buffalo Soldiers came to capturing Villa in April of 1916 during the punitive expedition.
What's interesting as well are the repercussions, particularly in Texas, of the Mexican Revolution. For example, one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of Houston takes place in August 1917, when you have black American soldiers, black U.S. soldiers from the North who come to Texas as a prelude to intervention in Mexico. But many of them were unaccustomed to Jim Crow, particularly the rigid U.S. apartheid that then obtained in Houston, and they shot up the town, which led to one of the largest court-martials in U.S. military history, with a number of these black American soldiers hung. And the others, of course, who were not necessarily implicated, were then shipped to Columbus, New Mexico, to provide fortification against future thrusts from Villa's forces. And that raises one of the more troubling aspects of, in my opinion, of African American history, which is how these Buffalo Soldiers were wielded, first of all, against the Native American groupings. Now, it's a very complicated question because if you look at what used to be called Indian Territory, Oklahoma, one of the reasons why the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw were called, quote, civilized, unquote, is because they owned enslaved Africans. And what's interesting there is that after the U.S. Civil War ended, the United States made these Native American slave owners disgorge more reparations to the enslaved than the Euro-American slave owners in Texas or Georgia, for example. And in fact, what's interesting as well is how they use this to disrupt the Native American economy. Because as you know, one of the key disrupting factors of the Native American economy was trying to break up common ownership of the land. And so the United States government mandated that they had to give land to these Black Americans formerly enslaved in what is now Oklahoma. And then, of course, there was some oil discovered on that land subsequently. And then in 1921, as we all know, in Tulsa, you had the plundering and pillaging of these Black Americans who had developed some wealth, not least coming out of the U.S. Civil War. And so this very tragic and unfortunate episode whereby Black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers become, or the Buffaloed Soldiers as I call them, to become the spearhead of the offensive against Native Americans. On the one hand, it was undermining the Black future in North America. And at the same time, it reveals also a point that we should not lose sight of, a basic point of social science, which is that the ruling ideas of any society generally are the ideas of the ruling class. And so the ruling class idea was that the Native Americans should be expropriated. They should move out of the way because they're stopping progress. Ironically and perversely, those ideas were imparted to the soldiers who then began to execute and implement those demented ideas. And then 1910 to 1920, you see the same process unfold. For example, the Black soldiers invading Mexico at the behest of U.S. imperialism, acting against their own interests objectively, and many of them barely escaping with their lives.
And I would argue it also it provides a justification later in the 1920s for discrimination, right? Where you touch on towards the end of the book where Mexico is forced by the U.S. to discriminate against welcoming any further African American immigration towards Mexico. And I think that's I think it contributes, right, in having negative images that you can stereotype and say, well, this is why we don't, trying to justify why Mexican authorities can't take in any more African American citizens.
Well, one book that needs to be written is how U.S. imperialism exported Jim Crow practices. For example, if Euro-American so-called white tourists went to a hotel in France and the hotel had Black customers and Black patrons, they would boycott that hotel and try to bring down that hotel. And so likewise, the United States put enormous pressure on Mexico to adopt and adapt U.S. practices. Now, of course, with regard to racism. Now, of course, this was nothing new. If you look at the bone of contention between Mexico and the United States in the 19th century before the U.S. Civil War, it was all about returning of enslaved property. And in fact, you had a number of episodes where U.S. posses would cross the border into Piedras Negras, for example, and grab fleeing enslaved Africans and dragging them back to Texas, for example. And this was a major flashpoint in terms of relations between the United States and Mexico. And I would also say that ultimately, this U.S. attempt to dismember Mexico through the war of aggression of the 1840s backfired, because it so weakened Mexico that it led directly to the French occupation of the 1860s. And then the French occupation of the 1860s was breathing life into the rebels who had tried to overthrow the United States government 1861 to 1865, because that was the whole point of these thousands of Southerners moving to Mexico. They were going to use Mexico as a rear base to resume the war. And once again, it almost worked, except for the second Juneteenth, June 19th, 1867, when the French puppet was executed.
And that's an important part of the history of Mexican sovereignty, right? I mean, obviously, 1821 joins 1867 as well, and as does the 1910 to 1920 period where the Porfiriato was finally overturned. One of the things that I found most interesting reading your book, Dr. Horn, was the long time and important presence of African Americans in the Southwest borderlands. That's something that's not discussed much. And for our purposes as La Raza Unida Party, we think about our homeland and our republic being Aztlan, or the Southwest Mexican cession. So it's interesting to think about the plurinationalism that you described there and how it's been there. NAACP chapters dealing with Klan activities in Phoenix, Buffalo Soldiers, as we've talked about extensively, but other Black communities as well throughout, existing and thriving in the area that we as revolutionary nationalists, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx organization and organizers think about. It complicates our history, and it makes it richer in terms of seeing common shared history, common shared territory, and common shared past. Not that contradictions don't exist. Obviously, we discussed a lot of them with the Buffalo Soldiers as well, but it's very enriching to hear this conversation and to think about Dia de la Revolución, the Mexican Revolution broadly, and Raza history. Are there any final points that either of you would like to address? We have a few minutes left.
Well, just a footnote to what you just said. As I point out in the book, some of the most significant victories against U.S. apartheid, U.S. Jim Crow, come in West Texas, the city we now refer to as El Paso. And I think it has a lot to do with the diversity, to use that current buzzword, of that particular West Texas city. That West Texas city was a kind of switching point. For example, going east, there's a resonant and rampant Jim Crow, and then once you go west, it tends to dissipate. And so that city is right in the middle of these swirling currents. And I think as we, speaking as a person who now lives in Texas and sees Texas in its relationship to the United States, as the United States in its relationship to the world, that is to say, Texas drives the United States to the right, the United States drives the world to the right. And so it seems to me that going forward, those of us interested in change really need to focus on changing Texas, because if we can drive Texas away from the right, we can help to drive the United States away from the right and help to make this a better planet on which to live.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. Dr. Macías?
I mean, I completely agree. I think Texas is, in a way, the pulse of the nation, right? Well, one thing I wanted to ask, and I really found fascinating, is the presence and thriving. I'm interested in about the African American presence in essentially ambos nogales. I lived there for many years, and so I just
And where?
Nogales is Nogales, Arizona.
Oh yeah, Charles Mingus' hometown.
Yeah, I just found I found your conversation about Nogales so fascinating, having lived there for many years, and usually that's my bordering crossing area. So if I were to identify with any border town, that would probably be it. I just found that the microcosms of Nogales and the tensions so it almost feels that Nogales is a microcosm of everything that's happening around the border. And I think you did a wonderful job with Nogales, and I think you could have an entire book on Nogales.
Mm. Well, as I was mentioning, the great jazz bassist Charles Mingus, who is defined as black in the United States, although of course he's a partial Mexican and Native American ancestry. His roots were in Nogales, Arizona, before migrating to Southern California, for example. So I guess the lesson to those who are listening, particularly those in the academy, is that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of struggle to execute. So we need to get with it.
Andale. Thank you, Dr. Horn. It was great having you again, Dr. Macías. It was wonderful to have you. This has been our Platica for November 2021. La Raza Unida Party has a study group every Wednesday. You can find it by looking us up on Facebook. We have links to our study group there and forms to sign up for it. Again, I want to thank Dr. Macías and Dr. Horn for coming today and speaking with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next Platica. Until then, que viva la raza!